This place is for decent folks, not people like that. The woman snapped, pointing across the diner with a perfectly manicured finger. All eyes shifted to the corner booth where an older man in a faded military jacket sat alone, steam from his untouched coffee curling into the morning light. He didn't look up, didn't flinch, just sat still, hands wrapped around the mug like someone holding on to something far heavier than coffee. A few diners exchanged nervous glances. One teenage waitress froze mid-pour, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. No one knew that the man being shamed in front of everyone was the very person who built the diner they were sitting in. And in just a few minutes, a single step through the front door would make every fork pause mid-air and every heart remember the word: respect. The Millstone Café had the kind of charm you couldn't fake: wood-paneled walls, worn leather booths, and the clatter of forks over hot plates. It was a Saturday morning like any other in Brookfield, Missouri. Locals packed the place before church or after the early farmers market. Truckers sipped black coffee, old friends traded gossip, and the scent of bacon and fresh biscuits hung in the air like a warm memory. Grace was halfway through her shift, balancing 3 mugs in one hand, her ponytail bouncing as she dodged a child playing near the jukebox. She was 17, saving tips for college, and knew most regulars by name. But today the tension was different, the kind you couldn't quite see but felt like the static in the air before a summer storm. Marjorie Layton pushed open the glass door with the same energy she brought into every room: entitlement. A tall woman in her 70s, still sharply dressed in a navy blazer and pearl earrings, she swept her gaze across the cafe like a queen entering her court. Her heels clicked purposefully across the tile. She held her designer purse close to her ribs, as if the room might rise up and snatch it from her. Then her eyes landed on Calvin Rourke. He was sitting in the corner booth, same place he always sat. Olive drab jacket, coffee cooling between his hands, staring out the window like the rest of the world didn't exist. To most people, he looked like a quiet old man clinging to forgotten routines. But to Marjorie, he looked like something else entirely. "Excuse me," she snapped loud enough to make the chime over the door ring again. Grace froze mid-step, mugs trembling. Marjorie pointed a manicured finger straight across the diner. "This place is for decent folks, not people like that." The clatter of forks quieted. A mother shushed her child. A man in overalls looked up from his pancakes. Grace swallowed, unsure if she should step forward or disappear. She looked at Calvin. He hadn't moved. Not even a blink. Just sat there, both hands around his cup like he was holding on to something heavier than coffee. "Filthy jacket," Marjorie continued, her voice shrill with contempt. "Looks like he hasn't had a proper bath in a week. And you let him sit by the window. It's disgusting." The young waitress glanced toward the kitchen. No sign of the manager yet. She turned back toward Marjorie, voice soft. "Ma'am, he's a regular here." "I don't care if he built the place with his bare hands," Marjorie snapped. "It's upsetting. It ruins the whole atmosphere." Grace's mouth opened, then closed. Behind her, no one spoke. Calvin stirred. Not much. Just enough to reach into his pocket and place a $5 bill on the table beside his cup. No protest. No defense. Not even a glare. He stood slowly, favoring one leg, his limp visible now. And still he said nothing. He walked toward the door, back straight, gaze forward. Grace stepped aside instinctively, heart pounding. The bell above the door jingled as he left. Marjorie huffed and turned toward the counter like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. In the silence that followed, something hung in the air. Shame, confusion, and something else that no one had words for just yet. No one knew that the man who had just been insulted and cast aside was the very man who owned the diner they were all sitting in. And in just a few minutes, that truth was going to shake every soul in the room. Calvin Rourke never talked about the war, not because he had nothing to say, but because the things worth saying were the hardest to speak aloud. He was 19 when he landed in Da Nang, Vietnam, barely old enough to vote, already old enough to carry the lives of men on his shoulders. A Marine recon scout trained for silence and survival, Calvin spent most of his tours deep in the jungle, gathering intelligence, marking paths, and navigating terrain where even the trees felt like enemies. His final mission, the one that cost him everything, came in the thick of monsoon season. Calvin's unit had been sent to extract 2 Navy medics pinned down after a chopper went down near the Laotian border. Radio contact was lost, and what little intel they had was outdated. Still, orders were orders, and Calvin had always followed through. It was pitch black when he led them in the rain so heavy it swallowed the sound of their boots. He moved with instinct, not sight, and somehow he found the clearing. The medics were alive, barely tucked beneath the wreckage of the chopper, with enemy forces closing in. There were 7 of them. Only 6 would make it out. Calvin was the last one out of the tree line when the mortar hit. He remembered the sound first, a deep snapping crack, then heat, then nothing. He woke up a week later in a military hospital in Japan, with shrapnel in his spine, hearing loss in one ear, and a leg that would never work right again. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. He didn't feel lucky. He felt unfinished. When he came home, it wasn't to parades or banners. It was to silence, to people crossing the street to avoid the man with the limp, to job applications that mysteriously lost his paperwork, to whispers in grocery aisles about those guys from over there. Vietnam veterans didn't come home heroes. They came home ghosts. So Calvin vanished. He moved west to Missouri, where no one knew his name, bought a rundown diner with what little he had left from his VA compensation and a low-interest loan. He didn't tell anyone he was a veteran. He didn't hang up medals. He didn't talk about war. Instead, he worked, quietly, relentlessly. 16-hour days flipping eggs, mopping floors, fixing leaks with duct tape and prayer. No fanfare, no complaints. But behind the silence, Calvin never stopped serving. If a man came in from the cold with no cash, Calvin made sure a plate of eggs and toast found its way to his booth. If a mother with 3 kids ordered one plate to share, Calvin doubled the portion and waved it off with a smile. If a young vet sat at the counter, jittery and unsure, Calvin made the coffee extra hot and never asked questions. He paid heating bills for neighbors through a local charity, donated anonymously to the VFW chapter without ever attending a meeting, helped patch roofs after storms, and left groceries on porches without knocking. People thought the diner survived because the food was good, but it survived because Calvin fed more than just hunger. He fed dignity, and yet no one knew. No plaques, no press, no stories. Just a man in a military jacket walking with a limp serving pancakes like his life depended on it. Until that morning, until a pointed finger tried to erase him, and something in the town, maybe the town itself, started to remember. The front door to the Millstone Café creaked open again, this time without the cheerful jingle from the bell. The sound was different, heavier, like the air shifted when it opened. A tall man stepped inside. Civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had spent decades in uniform. Shoulders back, eyes scanning the room with precise intention. Even the way he stood, feet slightly apart, chin lifted, said more than his clothes ever could. Colonel David Klein had arrived. He didn't look like much to the casual observer, just another older man in a pressed coat with salt and pepper hair. But his presence was undeniable. The diners fell silent, almost immediately, forks hovering in midair, like something invisible had just entered with him. Grace, standing by the soda fountain, felt her breath catch without understanding why. Klein's eyes swept across the cafe until they landed on an empty booth in the corner, the one Calvin had just vacated. The mug still sat there, half full, steam barely rising. "Excuse me?" Klein said, his voice firm but calm as he approached the counter. "I'm looking for a man named Calvin Rourke. Just saw him walk out." Marjorie, now seated near the counter, looked up with vague irritation. "If you mean the homeless man who was sitting there earlier," she said with a smug little sniff, "he left." "Good riddance." Grace opened her mouth, then closed it again. Klein's jaw tightened. He turned away from the counter and walked briskly toward the front door. Outside, Calvin was standing beside his beat-up Chevy pickup, fumbling with the keys, his limp more pronounced in the morning light. He hadn't noticed the SUV parked a few spots down, nor the man walking toward him with long, purposeful strides. But he recognized the footsteps. He turned slowly. His eyes widened. "Colonel Just David now?" Klein said, offering his hand. Calvin hesitated a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, but his eyes darted toward the diner's windows, where he knew curious faces were already watching. "Sir, if this is about some ceremony or press thing," Calvin began, but Klein cut him off. "This isn't about that. This is personal." The older man's voice was lower, now steadier. I've been looking for you, Calvin. I wanted to thank you properly. Calvin shifted uncomfortably. Sir, you don't have to. I do, Klein said firmly. You saved my life. You saved my men. I've walked my daughter down the aisle. I've watched my grandson pitch his first baseball game. And none of that happens if you didn't see what the rest of us missed that night in Cambodia. Calvin looked away. Klein took a breath and glanced back at the diner. You trying to disappear, he asked gently. Trying not to cause ripples, Calvin replied. Well, Klein said with a half smile, I think a ripple's already been made. And with that he turned and walked back toward the diner. Calvin hesitated, looked toward the highway. Freedom was still just a drive away, but instead he followed. When they walked back in, the entire cafe was watching. The clink of silverware was gone. Even the fry cook in the back had stopped mid-scramble. Marjorie blinked. What's he doing back in here? Colonel Klein raised a hand, signaling silence, then stepped forward. I'd like to say something, he announced. He placed a hand gently on Calvin's shoulder. This man, he said, pausing long enough for every eye to land on Calvin, is Calvin Rourke. He's the owner of this cafe, and he's one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege of serving with. A hush fell over the room. Klein continued. He didn't ask me to come. He didn't even want me to. But I came anyway, because people should know who they're sitting beside, who's pouring their coffee, who's been showing up here day after day not for applause, but because that's just who he is. Grace's eyes welled up. The young man at the back table lowered his head. A trucker set down his cup slowly. Marjorie's mouth opened, but no words came out. Klein glanced around the room once more. This man saved lives. He never asked for recognition. He just built this place and kept showing up. You may not have known who he was before, but now you do. Then he stepped back, letting the silence speak. And for the first time in years, Calvin Rourke looked up and truly saw, that he wasn't invisible anymore. Marjorie Layton sat frozen in her seat, her posture suddenly stiff, not from pride but from realization. She had spent decades perfecting her image, always polished, always in control. But now surrounded by silence and stares, all of it, the pearls, the blazer, the poise felt like paper armor. The man she had dismissed as a nobody was not only somebody, he was Calvin Rourke, a Marine, a survivor, the owner of the very diner she had insulted him in. And the worst part she saw now, he hadn't even flinched. He had let her insult him, not because he agreed, but because he didn't need to defend himself. That kind of strength shamed her more than any rebuke could. Calvin stood by the counter still, as if unsure what to do next. The eyes of the room rested on him, but his gaze was on the floor. Then slowly Marjorie rose from her booth. Every step she took toward him felt like a mile. Her heels clicked against the tile loud in the quiet space. But her voice when it came was different, thin, wavering, uncertain. Mr. Rourke, she said, then paused. Calvin. He looked up. She'd never seen eyes like his before. Quiet, but full of weight. Not the kind of weight you could see, but the kind that stayed with a person. The kind only a life of sacrifice could create. I owe you. She stopped again, searching for dignity in the rubble of her pride. I owe you a very deep apology. Calvin didn't answer. Not yet. I didn't know who you were. That doesn't excuse anything, she continued, voice trembling now. But it might explain why I reacted the way I did. You see, she swallowed, and for the first time that morning, her hands began to shake. My husband, Richard, was in the Navy. He served in Vietnam too. Came home with nightmares no one could understand. He'd scream in his sleep. Wake up drenched in sweat. Couldn't hold a job. People stared at him like he was broken. Grace stood by the soda fountain watching, holding a coffee pot she'd forgotten to serve. I spent years trying to help him act normal. I used to polish his shoes before he went out, made him wear long sleeves to cover his burns. I didn't want people to judge him. And yet, her voice cracked. Here I am, doing exactly what they did to him. The cafe stayed silent. I became the very thing that hurt the man I loved, she whispered. She looked down, then slowly met Calvin's eyes again. When I saw you sitting there this morning, I didn't see you. I saw my fear, my shame, my weakness. Tears gathered in her eyes, unashamed this time. I can't take back what I said, But I can say I'm sorry. Truly. A long pause. Then Calvin nodded. No speech, no sermon. Just a nod, a quiet gesture that said, I hear you. We all have bad days, he said, his voice low gravelly from years of silence. I hope tomorrow's better for you. And that was it. He didn't lecture her, didn't list his accomplishments, didn't demand anything. Grace blinked. She had expected fireworks, confrontation, a dramatic collapse. But this was something else, something stronger. Marjorie stared at him for another second, as if waiting for something more, then realizing she didn't deserve more. She reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and walked back to the booth Calvin had left earlier. She placed the bill gently next to the untouched coffee, and then she left. No more words, no more show, just silence. A few seconds later, the clatter of silverware resumed, softly at first, then gradually growing. But something in the air had shifted, not just in the room and the people. Grace finally set the coffee pot down and wiped her eyes on her sleeve. She wasn't crying, not really, but something in her chest felt full in a way she didn't understand. She looked at Calvin standing there in his worn jacket, a quiet man with a permanent limp, and hands that had carried more than most could imagine. He caught her glance and gave her a nod, just like he had to Marjorie. Not a thank you, not a command, just recognition. And in that second, Grace understood something. Respect wasn't loud. It didn't shout or demand attention. Sometimes it just stood still. And that, she thought, was the most powerful thing she'd ever seen. It started with whispers. A couple of regulars at Millstone Café told their neighbors what had happened that Saturday morning. Then someone's niece posted about it online. Grace, still shaken but inspired, wrote a short note on her school's community board titled, The Man in Booth 3. By Monday, the story had reached the local radio. By Friday, it was in the county newspaper. But none of it began with a press release. Calvin Rourke hadn't told a soul. He simply showed up the next day like always, 20 minutes before sunrise apron, on prepping pancake batter, and checking the coffee machine like nothing had happened. Except now, when he unlocked the front door, someone was already waiting. A veteran in a wheelchair. His name was Mike. The day after that, it was two older men in Vietnam vet hats who sat quietly near the window and nodded when Calvin limped past. Then came the Thursdays. Without planning, without signs or flyers, more and more veterans started coming in on Thursday mornings early before the breakfast rush. They didn't make speeches, didn't wear medals, just ordered black coffee and eggs, and sat at what became known as Ty's Corner, in quiet solidarity with a man who'd once saved lives, then disappeared into quiet service. Calvin never sat with them. He said it was their space, but he always kept their cups full, and somehow the coffee never got cold. Grace, watching from behind the counter, felt like something sacred was happening. She began to bring in a notebook and record names, branches of service, years, places they had served. At first, some hesitated, but Calvin gave a nod and they spoke. What began as a private list became something more. With help from her history teacher, Grace launched a small project called Voices of Service. She interviewed veterans from Brookfield and neighboring towns, collecting stories that had never been told. Some were short, just a paragraph. Others took hours. Some brought tears. Others brought laughter. But all of them carried the same echo: sacrifice, dignity, and silence. The back corner of the diner changed. What had once been a forgotten space near the restrooms became a tribute wall. Grace decorated it with photos, some donated, some copied from dusty albums, some printed from Calvin's own collection that he swore didn't exist. Above it, she mounted a simple wooden sign her father carved by hand: Respect is served here. Customers started bringing their own stories. A woman brought a photo of her grandfather in his World War II uniform. A boy in a Cub Scout shirt asked if he could put his great-uncle's dog tags on the wall. Calvin just nodded, eyes misty. Even Marjorie returned. She came quietly, no fanfare. One afternoon, she arrived with her grandson, a tall, quiet teenager in a blue hoodie. "This is Eli," she said to Calvin. "His dad's serving overseas, Marines. I thought maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence. Calvin sat with Eli for 20 minutes talking about responsibility service and what it meant to come home. He didn't mention gunfire or trauma, just community, belonging, honor. When they left, Eli shook Calvin's hand with both of his. A week later, the diner began offering free meals to any veteran on Thursdays, not because Calvin announced it, but because the register simply didn't ring them up. Grace handled it without a word. Calvin paid the difference out of pocket until a few patrons caught on, and quietly began leaving extra bills under their plates. The cafe changed. Not its layout, not the menu, but its spirit. Farmers still ordered the big Thai breakfast. Truckers still asked for extra bacon. Kids still fought over jelly packets. But there was a new kind of reverence in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. You could see it in the way people treated each other, in the way chairs were pulled out for strangers, in the way silence was respected when someone stood at the wall a little longer than expected. Calvin never liked the word hero. He always winced when someone used it. But to Grace and many others, he redefined it. He showed her that real leadership didn't come with stars or ribbons, but in quiet actions done without needing applause. He showed her that a man could save lives, serve his country, and then spend the rest of his days pouring coffee in peace and still be the strongest person in the room. Years later, when Grace was asked to speak at a county event honoring local veterans, she stood behind the podium, cleared her throat, and said, "I didn't learn about war from textbooks. I learned about it from a man who folded napkins before sunrise and limped across a diner floor for people who didn't know his name. His name was Calvin Rourke. He never asked us to remember him, but we always will." And just like that morning long ago, the room went quiet. Because some legacies aren't written in history books. They're written in breakfast booths, in the backs of diners, in the quiet way a man shows up and makes the whole town better. The sun still rose over Brookfield, the same way it always had, spilling soft gold across the two-lane highway, kissing the roof of the Millstone Café as dew clung to its windows. The world outside kept moving, rushing, honking, scrolling. But inside the diner, time moved slower, more deliberately. Calvin Rourke's days didn't change much. He still arrived before dawn, keys in hand, his limp steady but manageable. The routine never left him. It was in his bones. Unlock the door, turn on the lights, check the grill, make the first pot of coffee, wipe down the corner booth even if it hadn't been used. Only now he wasn't invisible. The silence he carried was no longer mistaken for insignificance. It had become something else: reverence, a quiet kind of leadership, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. People treated him differently now, though he never asked them to. The truckers nodded with more weight in their eyes. Veterans saluted him informally, 2 fingers to the temple, just enough for him to see. A local pastor even started bringing his confirmation class through once a month, always ending their lesson with a stop at the wall Grace had built in the back. Respect is served here, he'd remind them. Not just to food, but to those who served something bigger than themselves. Calvin never stopped moving. He still poured coffee like it was the most important task in the world. Still fixed broken table legs with the same hands that once carried wounded Marines through jungle brush. Still shook his head at overcooked bacon. Still made sure the widow down the street always got her eggs just the way her husband used to make them. But something had changed. He'd glance up sometimes from the counter and see Grace at table 2, notebook open, interviewing another vet. Or watch as someone new lingered in front of the tribute wall a little longer than expected. Or notice the young man in the back booth, a soldier home on leave, eating quietly alone but not unnoticed. He never said much, but when he smiled, it carried meaning. Because he knew that this was what peace looked like. Not parades, not speeches, just people gathering, healing, remembering. Sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the front window, during a lull jacket, still faded hair, thinner eyes, a little grayer. But behind those eyes was the knowledge that he'd lived a full life. Not an easy one, but an honest one. One morning, as Grace refilled the napkin holders, she glanced at him and said, "You ever think about putting those medals out here?" Calvin looked up from the register and shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Some men carry their medals on their chests. Others carry them in their silence." Grace didn't reply. She just nodded, heart full, because she finally understood, and so did everyone else. In a world where noise often wins, Calvin Rourke had shown them that quiet could lead, that kindness could echo, that service didn't end with discharge. Papers it carried on in the way a man treated strangers, how he cleaned a countertop, how he forgave, how he remembered. He didn't need a statue. He had a corner booth. He had a wall of names. He had a town that would never forget him, not because he asked them to, but because he earned it one unspoken moment at a time. And every morning as he turned the key in the diner door and watched the first light of day spill across the floor, he knew one thing for sure: respect is never demanded, it's lived. In a world where noise often wins, where headlines reward outrage and silence is mistaken for weakness, maybe it's time we remember men like Calvin Rourke. He didn't need a stage. He didn't demand applause. He just lived each day with quiet dignity, serving others, even when no one was watching. And perhaps that's the lesson for us all. Because today, respect seems harder to find. We judge by appearances. We shout before we listen. But Calvin's story reminds us that the strongest people often speak the least and give the most. So maybe next time we're in line behind someone moving slowly or see someone who doesn't look successful, we take a breath and choose patience over pride, kindness over assumption, respect over reaction. Some medals are worn on the chest, others are carried in silence, and both deserve to be honored. But here's something I'd love to ask you. Have you ever met someone like Calvin? Someone who changed your life without ever raising their voice? Or maybe, have you ever judged someone too quickly, then realized you were wrong? Let's open that conversation in the comments. Your story could help someone else see more clearly. Drop your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in quiet honor. We believe real heroes don't wear capes. They wear aprons, boots, and scars. And sometimes they're just pouring your morning coffee while carrying a history no one ever asked about. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, respect is served here.